All right, welcome back to the channel. Man, Terence Crawford just said something that was bananas. Wow. He says that Errol Spence, Danny Garcia, and Shawn Porter are not top welterweights, and he goes through his logic for why that is the case. The guy is just sounding real delusional in this thing he did on his Instagram. But let's talk about what Terence Crawford has to say about the welterweight division in this video. All right, welcome back. So Terence Crawford, man, the dude just keeps making the news. He gave a impromptu conversation on Instagram, and it was very, very entertaining. And you can tell that Terence Crawford is really listening to what a lot of people have to say about him, and he takes issue with the fact that people are saying that he's not fighting anybody. So since he has an issue with that, he defends himself and then points to the resumes of Danny Garcia, of Errol Spence Jr., and Shawn Porter, everybody except for Keith Thurman, because he kind of ran into a wall with Keith Thurman, but pretty much said, hey, that these guys must not be top welterweights, right? Because look at their resumes. And he walks through them. Now, it took me maybe 2 times listening to the argument to realize what Terence Crawford did. Terence Crawford pulled a straw man. And he basically, what he did was he made an argument that nobody is making at all, and then he defends it and knocks it down. And I was like, man, what are you doing? But let me explain it, because I don't even know if he intended to do this or if he knew that he did it. First things first, Terence Crawford is upset that people are saying that Terence Crawford isn't fighting anybody. That's what they're saying. Bud, you're not fighting anybody. Get that. Bud, not fighting anybody. Okay? Nobody is saying that Terence Crawford is not a top welterweight. Everybody says Terence Crawford's a top welterweight, right? They're just saying, Bud, you're not fighting anybody at welterweight. We want to see you fight somebody. But what he does is he then compares himself to Errol Spence and Danny Garcia and Shawn Porter, and then say, hey, these guys aren't top welterweights. No. Bud, again, see, that's the switch. That's how Bud switched it. Bud switched from people are saying that Bud's not fighting anybody, but nobody said that Bud's not a top welterweight. Then Bud, because he can't make an argument that these other guys aren't fighting anybody, he then changes the goal. He moves the entire goalpost to these guys are not top welterweights. And let's walk through it. Because he says, well, Danny Garcia is not a top welterweight. Now, he says, of course, himself, Terence Crawford, he knows that Danny Garcia is a top welterweight because he sees how good a fighter Danny Garcia is. But his point is that, well, if you look at Danny Garcia's resume, Danny Garcia can't be a top welterweight because he hasn't beaten anybody at welterweight, right? He didn't lose. He lost to Shawn Porter. He lost to Keith Thurman, and unless he beats, he's fighting Errol Spence, so he hasn't fought him yet. He hasn't beaten Errol Spence yet. So to date, Danny Garcia hasn't beaten anybody at welterweight, a top welterweight. And at first, I was like, man, really good argument, Terence. Until then, again, like I said in the beginning, I realized, hold on. I never said that Bud Crawford wasn't a top welterweight because he hasn't fought anybody. I know perfectly well that he's a top welterweight because I'm looking at how good a fighter he is. And that's the same thing that I think about Danny Garcia. I call him a top fighter. He's a top welterweight because I look at his skill set and I believe that, dang, there's not only a few welterweights that could beat him. And the guys that did beat him are top welterweights. But again, right? You got to keep your eye on the ball when you're dealing with Terence. Nice try, Terence. Nobody said nobody said that Danny Garcia was undefeated or that Danny Garcia beat everybody in the welterweight division and that's what makes him a top welterweight. No, people say he's a top welterweight because he fought people. But the issue with Terence Crawford is not that whether or not he's a top welterweight. The issue is whether or not you fought anybody. And you've not. Because if you look at Danny Garcia compared to Terence Crawford, who has Danny Garcia fought? He has fought Shawn Porter. He fought Keith Thurman. He fought Adrian Granados. He fought Robert the Ghost Guerrero. He fought these guys, right? He fought top welterweights. Bud has not done that. Again, but Bud, because he can't defend the fact that he ain't fought nobody, he moves the goalposts from Bud hasn't fought anybody to, oh, Danny's not a top welterweight. And then he does the same thing to Shawn Porter and says, well, look at Shawn Porter. Who is Shawn Porter beaten that would make him a top welterweight? He beat Danny Garcia, but Danny Garcia didn't beat anybody else. He lost all his close fights. Shoot, Shawn Porter lost his close fights. He lost 3 of his top fights, toughest fights. He lost to Kell Brook. He lost to Errol Spence. He lost to he just lost to those 2, and he beat Danny Garcia. Oh no, he lost to Keith Thurman, right? So you could say, well, maybe he's not a top welterweight because he lost those. Again, no, come back, Terrence. We're not saying that you have to beat everybody to be a top welterweight or you have to be undefeated to be a top welterweight. Again, Terrence, our issue is not that you're not a top. Nobody said you weren't a top welterweight. They said you weren't fighting anybody. And you can't say that about Shawn Porter. Shawn Porter has fought Errol Spence. He has fought Danny Garcia. He did fight Kell Brook. And matter of fact, he fought Kell Brook just like you said. He wasn't coming off of a loss when Shawn Porter fought him, right? He hadn't fought Gennady Golovkin yet. He fought the best Kell Brook that there was. So he gets credit for having fought him, right? For having fought him, for having won a belt against Paulie Malignaggi. I think he might have got it off Paulie Malignaggi. But again, nobody is saying that Bud, despite Bud making an argument that makes it seem as if people were saying that he's not a top welterweight. No, Bud, people are just saying you haven't fought anybody, and that's just the case, okay? Now, Errol Spence Jr., the same thing. Errol Spence Jr. has, well, first of all, he's undefeated, and he's beaten everybody he's fought. He beat Kell Brook. He beat Shawn Porter. He beat Lamont Peterson. He beat Mikey Garcia. He beat these guys, right? But again, nobody is saying that Errol Spence Jr., even to be a top welterweight, that if Errol had not gotten the call, that he wasn't possible for him to be a top welterweight. But it's also not possible to say that Errol Spence Jr. hasn't fought any top welterweights. On to the last part of it, man, where Bud acknowledges this, I'm telling you, man, it's like, dude, I don't know, man. Maybe the dude did take a couple too many shots to the head because he seems like he talks about how Bob Arum works for him. And it's like, come on, Bud. Bob Arum does not work for you. He says, well, hey, if there's no fighter, and, what's the promoter going to promote? The promoter works for me. No, because here's the fact. If there may be a lot of if there was no cattle, right, then there would be no farmer, right? There's no farmer, no beef. If a farmer's main product is cows, right? If the meat guy that owns the cows, their product of the cows, yeah, right. They wouldn't have that job if there weren't cows. But that doesn't mean that he works for the cows. No, he is chopping up them cows, selling them cows for hamburgers. Okay. The cows live and die at this particular dude's whim. That's just kind of what it is. Same thing with your relationship with Top Rank and Bob Arum, man. Do not act like you work. When Bob Arum can replace you with the next guy, you cannot replace him. Dude. Bob Arum does not work for you. And I really wish he would stop sharing that. But anyway, I hope that I was clear enough in what he did. Bud, people just want you to fight somebody, okay? Fight Shawn Porter, fight Keith Thurman. If you fight Errol Spence, not just Errol Spence or Manny Pacquiao, and that's all there is, and that's all there is to it. That's the issue, man. Nobody is saying that Bud Crawford is not a top welterweight. But they are saying, though, that none of the guys that Bud Crawford has fought is a top welterweight at the time that he fought him. And that is just more than fair. And that's just an actual fact. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.